Waiter refused to serve elderly black woman not knowing her son owned the restaurant. Why do people make assumptions about others based on appearance? What happens when those assumptions are not only wrong, but rooted in bias and racism? Can a single moment of discrimination spiral into something much bigger, something that reveals deep-seated issues we often ignore? What would you do if you witnessed an act of blatant racism in public? Would you stand up, or would you stay silent? The day had started like any other for Mrs. Evelyn Johnson. At 72 years old, she had lived through the civil rights movement, the marches, the fights, and the tears. She had seen the worst and best of humanity and carried the weight of those experiences in the wisdom etched into her face. Her son, Marcus, had always been her pride and joy, a man who had built a name for himself from nothing. Owning a chain of successful restaurants, Marcus had done what so many said was impossible for a black man. But none of that mattered in the eyes of the young white waiter who stood before Mrs. Johnson today. As she entered the restaurant, the warm aroma of spices and freshly cooked meals filled the air, but there was a tension she could not yet place. The young waiter glanced at her from across the room, his expression twisting into something uncomfortable. Why did his smile fade when he saw her? Why did the brightness in his eyes turn to annoyance? What was it about Mrs. Johnson that made him tighten his jaw and straighten his back? Could it have been the simple fact that she was an elderly black woman walking alone into an upscale restaurant? Mrs. Johnson sat down at a small table near the window, hoping for a quiet meal, unaware that what was about to happen would turn this peaceful lunch into a lesson, one for everyone in the room. "Excuse me, ma'am," the waiter said, approaching with a forced smile, his hands resting too firmly on the table, as though he was already in control of the situation. "I'm not sure if you're aware, but this restaurant is a bit on the expensive side." His words hung in the air. What was he implying? Did he assume she couldn't afford to be there? Mrs. Johnson looked around the room. Was anyone else hearing this? Did anyone else feel the weight of his assumption that she, based on nothing more than the color of her skin and her age, didn't belong? "Oh, I'm aware," she said softly, keeping her dignity intact even as her heart pounded in her chest. Was this the first time this had happened here? How many times had this waiter said something similar to other patrons who looked like her? And how many had simply left without making a fuss? But Mrs. Johnson was not one to back down easily. She had faced too many battles in her life to let this small act of racism slide. The waiter cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "Right. Well, we have a policy here, and we like to keep the place, reserved for certain clientele. I'm not sure you're familiar with the menu or the pricing." The insult was thinly veiled, but it hit harder than a slap across the face. What did he mean by certain clientele? Did he expect her to leave out of shame, perhaps hoping that she would slink away quietly so as not to make a scene? Mrs. Johnson remained composed, but inside, a storm was brewing. Why did this happen again and again in different places, under different circumstances, but always the same? Why was her dignity questioned simply because of the color of her skin? What would you do in that situation? Would you keep quiet to avoid confrontation, or would you stand up for yourself? Should you ever have to fight for the basic respect every person deserves? And most importantly, would anyone around you care enough to step in? The waiter continued, "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable somewhere a bit more casual. There's a diner down the street." Mrs. Johnson's fingers clenched around her napkin, the pain of every insult she'd ever endured rushing back to her like a tidal wave. But what the waiter didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that this wasn't just any restaurant. This was her son's restaurant. Marcus had built this place from the ground up, investing every ounce of his time and energy into making it the success it was today. And now, here stood one of his employees showing his true colors. Would the young man's face change when he realized who she was? Would his apology be sincere, or would it come from the fear of losing his job? As the waiter turned to walk away, Mrs. Johnson raised her voice, steady and firm. "Excuse me, young man, I'd like to place my order." He froze, as if debating whether to continue this charade or give in to her request. What kind of person refuses to serve someone just because they look different? Who taught him that it was acceptable to treat people this way? Reluctantly, the waiter turned back, his face an icy mask of forced politeness. "Very well, ma'am. What would you like?" Before she could respond, a voice boomed from across the room. "Is there a problem here?" It was Marcus. Tall, broad-shouldered, and with an air of authority that made the room fall silent. He walked over, his eyes locked on the waiter. He had been watching from the back, making sure everything ran smoothly. But what he saw now shook him to his core. What would you feel if you saw someone disrespecting your mother like this? What would you do if the very business you built with your own hands harbored someone who treated your family, or anyone for that matter, with such disdain? The waiter stammered, clearly unsure of who Marcus was. No problem. Just a misunderstanding." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "A misunderstanding, huh? Do you know who this is?" The waiter glanced at Mrs. Johnson, then back at Marcus, his confusion growing. "No. Should I?" Marcus leaned in, his voice dangerously calm. "This is my mother, the owner of this restaurant, and you just refused to serve her." Silence filled the room. Every patron had stopped eating, their eyes darting between the three figures at the center of this unfolding drama. How quickly does a person's arrogance crumble when they realize they've made a grave mistake? How fast do they retreat when they see their assumptions laid bare for all to witness? The waiter's face paled, his eyes wide with disbelief. I didn't know. I didn't mean." But was his apology genuine? Or was it the fear of losing his job that drove his sudden change in tone? Was he truly sorry for what he'd done, or just sorry that he got caught? Marcus didn't let him off the hook. "So you're telling me that if this was just any elderly black woman, you would have treated her this way?" The waiter's mouth opened, but no words came out. What excuse could he possibly give that would justify what he'd done? Could he admit, even to himself, that his actions were rooted in racism? Could he face the reality of his own prejudice? And what about the other diners? How many of them had seen what happened but chose to stay silent? Why do we let moments like this pass us by, hoping someone else will speak up? Someone else will take action? Mrs. Johnson watched the young man squirm, but she didn't want his career ruined. What she wanted was understanding, an acknowledgement of the pain his words had caused, not just for her, but for every person who had ever been in her shoes. Marcus folded his arms. "You owe my mother an apology, a real one." The waiter, his face red with shame, looked at Mrs. Johnson. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize. I shouldn't have treated you that way." But was that enough? How often do we accept empty apologies, thinking they're enough to heal wounds that go much deeper? Should people be forgiven just because they say the words, or is real change required? How do you know when someone has truly learned from their mistakes? Mrs. Johnson gave a small nod, her expression softening, but the damage had been done. This wasn't just about her. It was about a system of prejudice, about the countless people who had been turned away, insulted, or worse, simply because of how they looked. As Marcus led his mother to a private table, the weight of the moment lingered in the air. The other diners, who had witnessed everything, sat quietly, reflecting on what they had just seen. Would they leave the restaurant thinking about how they could do better? Or would they brush it off, grateful that it wasn't them in the hot seat? And what about the waiter? Would he change, or would he continue on, carrying the same biases, waiting for the next chance to exercise them? By the time their meal arrived, the tension had eased slightly, but the questions remained. How many other people would have to face moments like this? How many would stay silent out of fear? And how many, like Mrs. Johnson, would demand the respect they deserved, no matter the cost? Marcus sat down across from his mother, his expression filled with pride. "You handled that with grace," he said. Mrs. Johnson smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I've had a lifetime of practice." "So? What would you do? Would you stand up to injustice, or would you let it slide? Can we ever truly rid ourselves of the biases we carry, or will they always find a way to surface? And most importantly, what will you do next?"
If you've watched this far, comment which country you're watching from, and leave a 100 in the comment section, because you are type of person that likes to finish what they started. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to get notified whenever we drop new videos.